Okay, this is for Refuah, Cholim Klal Yisrael. And the next halacha we're going to discuss is slaughtering, or shoichet, as we also know. There are 4 prohibitions. Any form of taking a life, shortening a life, wounding, whether or not it causes a loss of blood, and fishing. Okay, which we may not have thought. Okay, an animal or other creature which could be dangerous may be killed, even if it seems passive. When a creature is harmful but not deadly, such as a wasp, it may be killed in a normal manner if it appears aggressive. If it does not pose a threat, it may be killed in a casual, inconspicuous manner. For example, by stepping on it in one's normal manner, or walking or leaving a glass over it. Okay. When checking one's vegetables to remove insects, one may not kill the insects by washing them off. Instead, one should remove the surrounding area of the vegetable and dispose of it together with the insects. Fly sprays may not be used to kill insects. They may only be used in a room with an open window or door to encourage the insects to escape. And one must not spray on the insects themselves. If an insect would die from flying into the spray, one would not be liable. So you spray into another space. Okay. Okay, but it says, remember we were talking yesterday about trapping, and we were talking about dangerous, harmful creatures or insects. So let's just go over that again. An animal or other creature which could be dangerous may be killed, even if it seems passive. Okay. May be killed in a normal manner if it appears aggressive. If it does not pose a threat, it can still be killed in a casual, inconspicuous manner. Okay, so that's good. That's actually good news.
Okay.
Yeah, I put it.
It's a bit tired. Jeez, I didn't have a chance.
Sean, did you have a hectic run?
Then I went with Gavin. We went, and then I had a lesson, and I had 2 students. I spoke to 2 students just before this. So.
Okay, so you must be tired. Shame.
Arthur's
been working like a Trojan. Shame.
Are you sure? But he said Arthur is only starting work at 8 p.m. Israel time.
Yes, it's 7 p.m. your time.
Yeah, I screwed up, guys.
You're already there, Arthur.
I'm on the bus now. On the bus.
Are you on the bus? Oh, gee whiz.
So I'm stuck in traffic.
On the what's that bus number? Jeez, I've forgotten. Then okay.
347.
Oh yes, that also goes to Tel Aviv. Yeah.
Okay, guys, can we start? All right, I'm going to share my screen. I want Gav. You want to read?
Sure. Okay, so the Mishnah lists various animals to which the death penalty for killing a person applies. Okay, the ox of a woman, the ox of minor orphans, the ox of minor orphans in the charge of a guardian, the ox of the wild, the consecrated ox, and the ox of a convert who died and has no hairs. All of these are liable to death if they kill a person. And then there is a dissenting opinion from Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the ox of the wild, consecrated ox, and the ox of a convert who died without heirs are all exempt from death because they have no owners.
Okay, good. All right, so the first thing I want to mention to you guys is that the ox of a convert who died, whether he has hair on his head or he doesn't, that doesn't make a difference as long as his heirs, he has no heirs to inherit him. Gavin, you gave me my laugh for the day. I appreciate it, mate. It was very funny, man.
Because I said hair.
You're in the hair business. I know you're obsessed with it.
I know. That's why I should have been more discreet and said shaitel instead of hair. I made a mistake. I'm sorry.
Listen, you make your money of people not having great hair. If anything, you should champion for the bald and the bereft.
I know. I agree.
Okay. So let me just tell you, if you have a look at the point where it talks about the dissenting opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, he bases it on Shmot chapter 21, verse 29, because the verse says, and its owner had been warned, implying that the owner is required. So that's why he doesn't agree with that. Okay. Now, just there's one or two things that I want to bring into play here. There's quite an echo. I think it's probably
from Arthur.
from the bus. Mate, can I mute you? Is that all right with you? I'm not even seeing you.
Yeah, just mute Arthur. It's from him. From his side.
Okay, I just want to know that Arthur's still enjoying the show. Some stress and traffic.
Yeah, there he is.
All right, mate. All right, so
Come in, go ahead.
let's just go to the Gemara.
Kitchen
So
or bathroom,
basically, guys, listen, the Gemara, the Mishnah itself,
there's
lists 6 oxen that are included in the rule of execution. 6 oxen, okay? So the Gemara gives the source. Now, that's the source that we were talking about in Exodus chapter 21, verse 28. This isn't in verse 29. I'm going to share that part of my screen with you, and that should give you a little bit of a better idea. Just give me 1 second.
Short, enjoy, huh? I know you can't talk. Draw.
Kabb, are you with me?
I am with you. I just got to visit here for a second. He's leaving now. Sorry. No, you can't talk. Don't worry. Cheers, bud.
All right. Let me just share the screen, and then we can read. All right. This has been a parody this year. All right. Kev, you want to read it?
Yeah. And the verse states in Exodus chapter 21, verse 29, and its owner had been warned, implying that an owner is required. And that's the Sefta chapter 4, verse 6. These are, verse 28, if an ox shall gore a man or woman, and he shall die, the ox shall surely be stoned. Its flesh may not be eaten, and the owner of the ox shall be innocent. But if it was an ox which gores habitually from yesterday and the day before yesterday, and its owner had been warned, but did not guard it, and it killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and even its owner shall die. If the ox shall gore a slave or a maidservant, 30 silver shekels shall he give to his master, and the ox shall be stoned.
Okay. So there is there's what you call, what word there do you think is superfluous? Guys, I'm testing.
No, I'm joking. Let me look for it. In 28 or 29, just do in 29.
29.
29. God.
Okay, the words appear a few times. So, look, what you should notice is that the Torah doesn't mention words irrelevantly. How's it, Stephen? Okay, so basically, guys, listen.
I don't know.
The word oxen is mentioned 6 times. So you don't need to mention that. Why would you need to mention that? That's what the Gemara is going to come and bring. It's going to teach us something. If I say to you guys, these are the oxen that are incumbent upon the death penalty and should be stoned, okay? I don't have to keep mentioning an ox shall gore a man and woman, and he shall die, and the ox shall surely be stoned. It's flesh, and the ox shall be innocent, and an ox which gores habitually, and the ox shall be stoned. All you have to say is, listen, guys, with regards to the rule of the ox, these are the laws. So it's saying that it's mentioning these things repeatedly, and there's a reason, because those extra word oxen are coming to teach you a principle. Okay? Now, what principle is this? So the Mishnah lists 6 oxen that are included in the rule of execution. The Gemara gives the source, which I've just given you now. And the rabbis taught in a brisa, shor, etc. In the passage of an ox that kills a person, the Torah writes the term ox, and the term ox again a total of 7 times. The 6 superfluous times, because the 1 time is needed in the beginning as an introduction to the subject, but the 6 superfluous uses of the term come to include in the Torah's decree of death the ox of a woman, the ox of minor orphans, the ox of minor orphans in charge of a guardian, the ox of the wild, the ox of a convert who had no heirs, and a consecrated ox. Okay? Because you would think that maybe these are not included. That's why it came to teach you these other aspects. Does that make sense? Because
but it still didn't.
Yeah.
Still don't see why it mentions ox so many times. You can still have all the points and just put the ox once.
Yes, exactly, and that's what I'm trying to tell you. Is those extra term oxen come into this Mishnah because the Mishnah says it's teaching us 6 additional principles. When it mentions ox 7 times, the 6 principles you can learn that once, exactly as Gavin said. But what are the extra 6 words of ox coming to teach you? And that's where the Mishnah begins. The Mishnah lists various animals to which the death penalty for killing a person applies. Now, these are things that we don't quite understand. Let me tell you why. If I say to you the ox of a wild, do you remember when we learned in a previous Mishnah that an ox who has no owner, how are you going to litigate the owner of the ox that does damage?
Impossible.
It's impossible, right? And we also learned that who are you warning here? Are you warning the ox that's muad or the owner of the ox? Because if you want to say that you're warning the owner of the ox and there's no owner, well, how can the ox ever come to muad status? If the owner has to be present in all cases for the warning, as well as the animal itself. So why? To identify the animal. You're not saying you naughty ox because the ox is going to comprehend what you've done. The owner has to be there because it's saying, be cognizant of the animal that's under your charge and you have to look after it. And if you fail to do so, there's going to be heavy penalties. Okay? So if it has no owner, you would think there's no need for, execution of the ox. Okay. Now, we're not talking at this stage about penalties to the owners. So it's not entirely a chiddush. Let me give you an example, Gavin. Say I said to you that there was a lion going around killing people in Kenya. In the old days, you remember when it was still a common, when it was still part of the British Empire and part of the Commonwealth like South Africa.
Colony, yes, colonial.
Colonial, that's it, Kevin, thanks. Sorry, but I couldn't think of the word. So whenever you're talking about a colonial-based system, when you had animals that were carnivorous that killed people, they killed those animals because they developed a taste for blood. Now, today they don't do that. They shoot at the ground because these animals are an endangered species. But when they had no concept of conservation and people were endangered, they'd kill the animal. So what we're saying is here, listen, you have to discern between the difference between whether the animal gets executed and the owner gets prosecuted. They're 2 different issues. So Stephen, say for example, a lion comes to attack a cousin of yours, right? Then in that particular case, they put that lion down even if the lion was wild and had no owner. So there's a difference between charging the animal's owner for the damages or the death or the injury and putting the animal to death. Animals are put to death for what reason, guys?
Well,
Stephen,
because they've killed
Stephen, why do you think animals are put to death? That gore?
Well, vicious, some wild animals, tame, like you said, oxen.
Exactly. So you don't put a tame animal to death, and you don't even put a muad animal to death that kills another animal. But the minute it kills a person, for sure you put that animal to death because it's a danger to other people. It's developed a taste for aggressive behavior towards human beings. So we're saying that
So certain animals are locked up.
Correct. So we say
Wild
it's
animal.
not entirely a chiddush. Even if it has no owner, you can understand why the Mishnah says you still would put it down, even if you think, well, why? Because you cannot prosecute because there is no owner. Am I making sense? So we're saying, let's take the ox of somebody that is a mentally incompetent person. Why is an orphan mentally incompetent? Well, we're not really saying an orphan doesn't have parents to guide him, but let's take a minor, for example, or somebody that's a deaf mute or insane. They don't have the mental capabilities to see the consequence of action. And therefore, we don't necessarily, there are opinions that say we don't prosecute them, and other opinions that say, well, the person will still damage we do. But even if you hold that we don't prosecute them for whatever reason, the animals that have killed a person gets put to death, even if they're not prosecuted. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. So it's coming to include the Torah's decree of death of the ox of a woman, the ox of orphans, the ox of minor orphans in the charge of a guardian. We learned that. The ox of the wild, the consecrated ox, the ox of a convert who died and had no heirs. And Rabbi Yehuda says the ox of the wild, the consecrated ox, and the ox of a convert who died and have no heirs are exempt from the penalty of death because they have no owners. Yeah. So that's the major difference, because Rabbi Yehuda maintains that all oxen are included in the law of execution, even without a scriptural inclusion. However, he basically holds that the Torah's mention of the ox's owner implies an exclusion for the ox without an owner. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So the Gemara draws a conclusion from the Mishnah's list. Rav Huna said, Rav Yehuda would exempt an ox from death, even if it gored and its owner subsequently consecrated it, or if it gored and its owner subsequently declared it ownerless. Okay? Although it wasn't ownerless at the time it killed the person, since it became ownerless before it could be sentenced, it's exempt from death. So you have to get it in that window period between the time it killed and before the animal was sentenced. Okay? So how do you do that? Well, there's a couple of ways. You obviously can pretend you don't own the animal, although to me, the only thing that could get rid of is your liability aspect on earth, not in Shemayim. But more than that, you don't get benefit from the animal. I think one of the things to do is probably to slaughter and eat it. That or slaughter to do something. I mean, at least you could get the animal benefit. From where do I know this? Since the Mishnah states two separate cases: the ox of the wild and the ox of a convert who died and has no heirs. Now, guys, the ox of a convert who died without heirs, like what is it? Since the convert doesn't have heirs, it's simply an ownerless ox. That's all it is. So you could say that the ox of the wild is the same as the case of the ox of the convert who died and doesn't have any heirs. Both are examples of an ownerless ox. And the law that applies to one certainly applies to the other. So why did the Mishnah mention each case separately? Do you guys have an idea? Okay.
Well, it's obviously not that obvious.
Exactly. Well said. Rather,
Would
it's
be there.
not that this Mishnah informs us by giving a second example of an ownerless animal, that even an ox gored and subsequently its owner consecrated it, or gored and owner subsequently declared it ownerless. The question of the ox's liability is subject to the same dispute of the Tana Kamma and Rabbi Yehuda. Learn from this that Rabbi Yehuda exempts the ox from death, even if it had the owner at the time it committed the act. So, guys, there seems to be a very clear difference. Okay, if it was a convert that was Jewish and he had no halachic heirs, okay, because it's a contrasting case. He was alive when the ox killed, right? And subsequently after the goring, but before the trial, he died. Okay, he didn't leave any heirs. The ox is still exempt. And once we know that Rabbi Yehuda exempts the ox that became ownerless after the goring, but before the trial, We understand that he likewise exempts an ox that was consecrated after the goring but before the trial, because Rabbi Yehuda's exemption of the consecrated ox is also due to the lack of the owner. So what we are saying is that you couldn't necessarily deduce that from the fact that the ox never had an owner at all. In other words, I have an owner, I'm the owner of an ox and it killed. Now, I decide to consecrate it to the temple. Now, an institution owns it, not a private individual, okay? And therefore, it's now technically ownerless by me. But because it's owned by the institution of the Beit HaMikdash, it's not considered owned by a natural person. It's an entity. And therefore, you can consecrate it before it was sentenced. But we wouldn't have known that if we mentioned about the wild ox, because it never had an owner. In the case of a convert, he was alive while it gored and he died before sentencing. And since he had no heirs, the ox is ownerless. So therefore, there's no, we learned in that particular case that the same rule would apply in terms of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah, the Tanna Kamma is saying that if it has no owners, you still put the animal to death, and Rabbi Yehuda said you don't. That's just the main argument, okay? So, in other words, let me just state Rabbi Yehuda's view. So he also taught in the Bryce, and moreover, Rabbi Yehuda said, even an ox gored and its owner subsequently consecrated it, or gored and its owner subsequently declared it ownerless, it's exempt from the death penalty. For in the verse of Muad, it stated, and its owners had been warned and it killed, etc. So this teaches that an ox is not put to death unless the death of the victim and the standing of the ox before the court of judgment are alike. What does it mean? Just as it belonged to an owner at the time it killed, it must also have an owner at the time it's judged. So Rabbi Yehuda's statement implies that it's liable for death. The ox must be owned only until it appears before the court for judgment. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Why don't we require that the ox be owned until the verdict is pronounced? Why the phrase, the ox shall be stoned, that appears at the end of this verse is a reference to the verdict. Hence the words that follow in this verse, and even its owner shall die, should teach that the requirement of ownership applies at the time of the verdict as well. So the Gemara concurs and amends the Bryce accordingly, rather state the Bryce as follows: unless the death of the victim, the standing of the ox before the court in judgment, and the issuance of the verdict alike. Okay? Which means that basically the Torah refers to warning the owner of the ox as well as making sure that the animal is valid at the trial. Okay, so basically if the owner sold it to another person before sentencing, maybe rather than declaring it ownerless or consecrated, it would still be exempt from execution according to Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, Rashba and Tosfot and Rabbeinu Peretz don't agree with that. The verse is simply teaching that during the period the ox must be privately owned, but not necessarily have the same owner. Hence, if it's consecrated to the temple or declared ownerless in the interim, the exemption applies. But if it's sold to another person, the exemption does not apply. So it has to be sold to either an entity or declared ownerless. So just in summary, the ox of a woman, the ox of minor orphans, the ox of the wild, the ox of minor orphans in the charge of a guardian, the ox of a convert who died without heirs, all of these are liable to death if they kill a person. Rabbi Yehuda says the ox of the wild, the consecrated, and the ox of the convert who died without heirs are all exempt from death because they have no owners. All right, we've done that Mishnah and we've done that Gemara. Are there any questions before we go to the next Mishnah and the next Gemara?
I'm fine. Kevin? Seems
Okay.
all right. Let's go.
Sorry.
On the screen. Well, guys, was that quick or was that quick?
Awesome. Are we finished already?
No, we finished that part.
The Mishnah.
No, I'm joking.
It's
No.
faster than quick, Damon.
It
It's
was
super
faster than
fast.
quick. Super fast.
Quick fast.
It's
Quick
lightning.
fast. I don't know. Warp speed.
Is Arthur already at
It's the
at
Beit Protea.
plant?
He's listening. There he is.
He's
He's still
walking.
cycling.
I'm not a bad friend here. I'm just following a map to Eskilo Hospital. That's probably why I can hear you. You probably can't see me. I'm looking at the map.
No, that's okay, mate. I just want to know if you're okay.
So I'm going
Look
back
at the
to
map
the
and
map
look at
now.
the road.
Ooh, that was on the car. No, I'm joking.
Don't joke like that.
Okay, don't joke like
Just got across.
that. All right. Gavin, you want to read?
Sure. An ox that is leaving the courthouse to be stoned and its owner consecrated it, I having been sentenced to death for killing a person, the ox was in the process of being led to the execution when its owner arose and consecrated it to the temple. What a cheek. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So is not, and I'm going to share the second part. Now, just give me a second. The Gemara, the Mishnah is split over 2 pages. Give me a sec.
Just put Arthur on. There we go. He's going on and off. Can you put him off?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. This is the second part. Okay, Gab. So it's not deemed consecrated. Sorry. Continue.
Yeah, okay. It's not deemed consecrated. If he slaughtered it, its meat is prohibited. But if before its verdict was reached, the owner consecrated it, it is deemed consecrated. And if he slaughtered it, obviously before the court hearing, its meat is permitted.
Okay. All right. So that goes without saying. I'm going to then share the last part with you of that particular Mishnah because it turns to a new topic. Yeah, exactly as you said. What a cheek, Gavin.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
They should have a court. Honestly, Damon, sorry, I know I'm interrupting. I won't do it again. They should have a court for midot. People with bad midot. That's all. That's what I would like to see. Yeah. All right.
100%. Agree on that one.
Yeah, Steve, you want to read this new topic a sec?
Yeah, let Steve read it. Can you see it, Steve?
Yeah, more visited these days. The Mishnah. Okay. Masura Shomer.
No, just
not
in English. We all
just English.
people
Just
here.
English.
Okay.
You don't
If
do
the owner of an animal entrusted it to the care of an unpaid, yeah, I remember that. Shomer. That's a guardian thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Borrow a paid shomer or a renter. Then the animal damaged. He, the shomer, takes the place of an owner. He is responsible for the damage as he would have been the animal's owner. For a moad, he pays full damages. For a tam, he pays half damages.
Okay, perfect. Right, so I'm going to just start and tell you. So basically, the top part, the Gemara elaborates upon the Mishnah's first ruling. The rabbis taught in a brisa regarding an ox that killed a person. The law is as follows. As long as its guilty verdict was not yet reached, okay? If the owner sold it, it's sold. In other words, the sale is valid, specifically for plowing. That we learned, in other words, for use, etc. If he consecrated it, it's consecrated. If he slaughtered it, its meat is permitted for benefit. Okay, so all we're saying there in that first Mishnah, according to the Gemara, is exactly as Gavin said, the person's very cheeky. If after the sentence has been passed, you can't get any benefit or do anything with the animal. It's dead animal walking. You can't do anything. So even according to the rabbis, cited at the end of the previous Amud, who don't require that the animal have the same owner at the time of the verdict as when it's killed, so that the sale of the animal before its verdict will not prevent it from being sentenced to death. The sale is effective in regard to plying, okay? Although the animal will be stoned once it's convicted, the consecration has significance is in that if basically somebody derives benefit from the animal before it's stoned, he's guilty of me'ilah, because you can't derive benefit from something belonging to the temple. So
What's me'ilah?
basically, according to Rashi, only the consecration has significance in regard to me'ilah, because it's necessary, according to the view of the rabbis, that an animal that is consecrated after it killed is stoned. According to Rav Yehuda's view, that animal is exempt from the death penalty. However, the significance of the consecration is obviously far more reaching. So, Stephen, all we're saying is once the verdict is passed, you can't touch the animal. That's the bottom line.
That
Okay.
me'ilah means.
Yeah. Me'ilah means that you're using something hekdesh, something consecrated for mundane purposes. So it's like I'm using a pair to fill into tow my car.
Okay.
Or yeah, I'm using anything that's holy for relaxation. So if I have a party bash with my friends, I'll give you an example. Remember during that story with Achashverosh of drinking from temple vessels, etc.
Yes.
Look at the punishment he got, and he wasn't even a Jew. Imagine the punishment a Jew gets from using temple vessels. It's a big deal. You can't. It's a death penalty. So now let's get into the next topic quickly. If a shomer returned to its owner's domain, in other words, after having been entrusted to a shomer, the ox killed a man, and then before the ox was sentenced, the shomer returned it to its owner. It's deemed returned. Okay. Once its guilty verdict was reached, however, if the owner sold it, it is not sold. If he consecrated it, it is not consecrated. If he slaughtered it, its meat is forbidden for benefit. If a shomer returned it to the owner's domain, it's not deemed returned. Even after its guilty verdict was reached, if the shomer returned it to its owner, it's deemed returned. So basically, how do I word this? All right, I'm going to get rid of the detail. So the Gemara analyzes the dispute. Shall we say that they argue in the following point? That the rabbis hold that one cannot say with respect to articles that are forbidden for benefit, behold, what is yours is before you. Whereas Rav Yaakov holds that one can say with respect to articles that are forbidden for benefit, behold, what is yours is before you. So what it's actually saying is as follows. Look, if an article that's become forbidden for benefit is physically speaking the same article that the owner entrusted to the guardian, right, to the shomer, nevertheless, the rabbis maintain that the shomer's obligation is not discharged by his returning the article to the owner, because the article is now worthless. The owner can say, well, you've returned nothing to me. Okay? But Rav Yaakov maintains that since the damage to the article is physically not discernible, the shomer may simply place the article before the owner and say, here's your item. Okay? So do you remember we learned this? In the very beginning, there was a whole rule with Rav Chisda and Rabbi Yehuda. I don't know if you remember. There were like 24 items that were listed. And some of the items that weren't having any qualitative physical differences. So there was a question, are you deemed liable for damage? I don't know if you remember that discussion with Rav Chisda. We were talking about, for example, teruma, or things that had tumah in them, etc. So let me put it like this to you. You've got an article that has got tumah because there's a seminal emission. So in the days when or a woman was in her niddah period and she touched foods or whatever, or you had truma touch and infected stuff that Kohanim couldn't eat. Now, has the product changed in quality in any way?
No.
Not at all. Because if you sold it to a non-Jew, you see, they discern the difference between if you turned wine into vinegar, and there was a qualitative difference, versus if it just became spiritually or ritually impure, but it maintained its high quality. So there are some that maintain, well, it's not discernible damage. Okay? And therefore you don't pay in that discernible damage. And others that said, well, if you can't derive benefit and it becomes useless, then in that particular case, like, for example, animal that could have been given to the temple, but now maybe only Kohanim can have it, or whatever the case may be, then you've actually limited your value on what the article's worth, unless you sell it to a non-Jew. So that's deemed actual damage by some rabbis, but Rav Yaakov said there's no discernible damage, so the owner can basically return the animal. So this is what we say. The animal gored, it's sentenced to death, it's now technically worthless. But is the animal worthless? No, it looks like a living, breathing animal. So the rabbis say, listen, if the verdict wasn't reached, he can return it. Okay? Why? It's discernibly okay. But Rav Yaakov is turning around and saying, look, that you can't do that because look, there is a discernment, because if it wasn't yet a guilty verdict, there is no problem with it because the animal hasn't been sentenced yet. We said you could sell it. We're talking about after the guilty verdict. So after the guilty verdict, the rabbis are saying you can't derive benefit, which means you can't return it to the owner, because he's saying, well, you need to pay me a new ox because you got my ox killed under your charge. And Rav Yaakov said that the shomer, the guardian, could turn around and say, listen, the ox is still an ox. That's your problem. There's no discernible difference. All right, guys, listen, we don't have to make the shares an hour because Arthur's going to work now. Let's end off on this note. I think we've all had a long